Hollywood in the 1950s was a world of illusion, so convincing even the people within it started to believe their own roles. Behind the gleam of the Klieg lights, the velvet of red carpets, and the practiced elegance of stars gliding past each other at cocktail parties, there lived an entire population in shadows, a population of longing glances, locked doors, false marriages, and coded language. The truth, as I learned early on, was never in the magazines or on the silver screen. It was in the pauses between conversations, the drinks that lingered too long, the silences that followed a laugh. I was 23 when I first arrived in Los Angeles, clutching a studio contract in one hand and a suitcase full of nerves in the other. My name was still Henry McInnes Jr. then, and I had no idea that in a matter of years I would be living two lives, one for the public and one for the truth. They called me Jeffrey Hunter, and that name would soon be lit up on theater mares, printed on gossip columns, and whispered by women who saw in me the leading man their fantasies had conjured. But inside I was something else, something that couldn't exist in that world. Not if I wanted to survive. I learned quickly that Hollywood was a city of masks. Even the walls seemed to wear them. If you wanted a career, you gave them a version of you they could sell. You didn't have to be that person. You just had to pretend. Better than the rest. And in that game, I was cast early as the ideal American male. Handsome, soft-spoken, church-going, a war veteran's son with a square jaw and a noble heart. It didn't matter what I whispered in the dark. It didn't matter who I loved. What mattered was that I looked the part, that I could kiss a woman on screen and sell it like gospel. And so I played the part in movies, in interviews, in my own life. I dated actresses, many of whom were in the same predicament I was. Some of them were kind, some calculating, but all of us were trapped in a system that rewarded conformity and punished authenticity. Behind every glamorous couple in those days was a contract, a PR manager, and a silent understanding. You smiled when they told you to. You held hands at premieres. You denied. And if you slipped, the studio cleaned it up with money, with threats, with sudden vacations in Europe. Careers were buried quietly. Scandals were scrubbed with such precision. The truth never stood a chance. But the truth has a way of living on, even if only in the minds of those who carry it. And I've carried more than my share. As I sit here now, older than I ever thought I'd live to be, I find myself haunted, not by the roles I played, but by the men I loved and could never name. Not then, maybe not even now. But I want to try. I want to speak, not to provoke scandal, but to honor memory, to reclaim in some way the parts of myself I was forced to amputate. The men who shared with me not only affection, but fear. Fear of being seen, fear of being exposed, fear of losing everything for simply being what we were. There was Tay the First. He wasn't a star yet, just another pretty face in acting class with cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass, and a laugh that could make you forget yourself. He'd come from the Midwest like me, wide-eyed and humble, but with a restlessness in his bones that I recognized immediately. We were drawn together like magnets, pretending to study monologues while finding excuses to touch each other's hands under the table. We didn't have a name for it, and that made it easier in some ways. You couldn't confess to something that didn't officially exist. At night, in borrowed apartments or the occasional safe hotel, we were free for a few hours. We made plans that we never intended to keep, to move to Paris, to disappear from the spotlight before it swallowed us. But we both knew we wouldn't. We were already too deep in the machinery. T would go on to become one of the most celebrated actors of his generation. His name still graces film retrospectives and Oscar montages. But when he died, they called him a lifelong bachelor, a recluse. They said he was too focused on his craft to settle down. I watched those tributes with a stomach full of acid. They had no idea, or maybe they did and they simply chose silence. I'd grown used to that. Silence in Hollywood was a kind of currency. It was the price of proximity. If you wanted to be close to power, to fame, to beauty, you learned quickly when to shut your mouth. Then there was Jay, older than me by 10 years, but youthful in a way I could never be. He was dashing, dangerous, and effortlessly charming. Everything I had been told to avoid. We met during a studio event, introduced under the pretense of a possible co-star arrangement. He brushed my hand under the table as we drank scotch and laughed louder than anyone else in the room. The next morning, he sent flowers to my apartment, lilies, with a note that said simply, "You don't have to pretend with me." That note became a kind of talisman for me. I kept it for years in a shoebox under my bed, even long after he had moved on to newer faces and louder parties. He was reckless in a way I envied. He didn't care who saw, or at least he pretended not to. He dared to walk close to the line, knowing that the studio would protect him because he was bankable, and bankability was immunity, but immunity had its limits. I remember the night he was arrested quietly, discreetly, after being found in the wrong bar, at the wrong hour, with the wrong company. The studio spun it masterfully, turning it into a misunderstanding, a case of mistaken identity. Jay took a sabbatical in Mexico. When he returned, he was thinner, quieter, and more compliant. The fire in him had been extinguished, or at least smothered. We saw each other once after that briefly, at a mutual friend's home. He hugged me too long and whispered, "Don't end up like me." I didn't see him again. I've often wondered if we were cowards, if our silence made us complicit in our own erasure, but then I remember what the stakes were. To be found out in those days was not just to lose a job, it was to lose everything. Your name, your reputation, your safety. Tabloids were ruthless. Agents were quick to cut ties. Directors stopped returning calls. The studio that once built you would bury you faster than any grave. And so we smiled. We kissed women at premieres. We went on stage to double dates. And in the quiet of our homes, we wept into the shoulders of men who knew that pain intimately. I'm not writing this for pity. I had a good life by many measures. I traveled, I made films I'm proud of. I loved and was loved in secret. But secrets grow heavy over time. They accumulate like dust on old reels of film, warping the image until you forget what was real. I look at old photographs now, publicity stills of me with actresses I never touched, behind scenes, shots of parties I never enjoyed. And I wonder who I could have been if I hadn't been afraid. If any of us hadn't, there were more. Too many to name. Some were fellow actors. Some were makeup artists, costume designers, writers. Some were married. Some were so deep in denial they could only express affection in anger. We found each other in coded glances, in whispered rendezvous, in the language of longing that only those in hiding understand. There were few safe places, but when we found them, bars in West Hollywood, private houses with blackout curtains, they felt like sanctuary. And then morning would come, and we would vanish back into our roles, smiling, masculine, untouchable. There's a photograph of me from 1954 taken on the set of 7 Angry Men. I'm standing alone, holding a coffee cup, looking slightly to the left. I remember that day clearly because I had just come from a night with R, a young studio contract player, with a voice like silk and eyes that begged for freedom. We'd spent the night talking about what our lives might look like in 20 years. He said he wanted to be out by then. "I won't hide forever," he told me as he traced circles on my arm. I wanted to believe him, but as I stood on set the next day, surrounded by crew and lights and expectations, I knew we wouldn't make it that long. Not out loud, not in the open. Subscribe to Whispers Dust for more emotional stories behind music legends and the feuds that shaped rock history. Tap the bell to never miss a beat.